city of God. You see it.
Good morning. It is great to spend this moment with you in worship, whether you're joining us here online or whether you are here with us in the building. And I'm so glad that we get to spend this time worshiping our God together. I have shared this verse at the beginning of several sermons throughout our quarantine period. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And one thing I've been thinking about this week is just the resiliency of God's people to find something to rejoice in the days that God has given us, even when they may not be what we expect. And I'm thankful for that from you. We're going to be spending our time today in the book of Esther, as we have been the past several weeks. So if you have a Bible, I'd like to be turning there or pulling it up on your phone. Those of you who are watching online, you may have noticed that there is a song sheet as well as a sermon handout for this week's sermon. And those in the building, you may have picked one of those up on the way in as well. It's not necessary, but it might be helpful to follow along with our lesson for today. So feel free to make use of that. Going to be in Esther. Have you ever wondered, is God still with us? You ever asked the question, is God present with us still? When bad things happen, have you ever ventured to wonder, did God play a role in that? Or even the opposite, when something beautiful bursts into your life and blesses you, do you have this tendency to ask, Lord, was that you, your doing? Has God caused this thing, this good thing, to take place? I think that the book of Esther is dealing with questions like that. But it has no easy answers to those questions. And for that matter, it kind of has a funny way of going about talking about it too. Because in this book that has so much to teach us about God's presence, God's providence, God's plan, the name of God is actually never mentioned. Now, some of you may know this from before, but the name of God not once appears in the book of Esther. The name of the king of Persia comes up 190 times in Esther, but God or Lord or any other name that would apply to God, not once in the 5,000 words of the book of Esther, not once do we find it there. And isn't that kind of strange? It's the only book of the Bible like that, of course. And here we are at a moment when God's people are in dire trouble, and not once does his name appear. And it's not just that either. Not only does the name of God not appear in Esther, but also so many other things that remind us of God and the way that God's people relate with God, especially in times of trouble. All of those things are absent from Esther too. Did you know that not once is prayer mentioned in Esther? There are times when people are fasting, and that often implies prayer, but there's no time when someone says a prayer or we have a spoken prayer or prayers mentioned in the book of Esther. There's not one single time when a sacrifice is made in Esther, that very fundamental way of worshiping God in the Old Testament. Not once does it appear. Not one mention of the law in Esther. Do you know how important the law was to God's people, the Jews? Not once is it mentioned here. No mention of God's covenant in Esther. And wouldn't this be a time to dwell on God's covenant, his promises to be faithful when everything is crumbling down? But not once is the covenant mentioned here. No Jerusalem, no mention of the temple, no mention of the Jewish dietary rules, even as Esther goes in and takes of the king's food. In the book of Daniel, that would be a bridge too far, but here it just goes by with no comments. Isn't that fascinating? All these things. A book where God and all of the familiar reminders of God's presence in the lives of his people, all of them seemingly vanish from view. Isn't it strange? It makes you wonder almost, is that what it was like to live in those days? I wonder, when I look at the way that this story is written, it makes me wonder, is the story written the way that it is written because that's how it felt for Mordecai or for Esther or for all of the people of the Jews in Persia to be living beneath the weight of this seemingly silence on the part of God, when you could actually wonder, is God with us still? When you might reasonably ask, did God cause these things to be so? And so far in Esther, we've spent 3 weeks in Esther. The closest thing we've gotten to an answer to those questions is when Mordecai simply says, who knows? I'm talking about Esther chapter 4, verse 13. If you want to take a moment and look at it again, this is that pivotal moment, right? When Mordecai is convincing Esther to go to the king, and he's telling her how important it will be to do so. And even there, he doesn't mention God's name. Take a look. He says, relief and deliverance will arise from another place. And who knows? Who knows? Well, today it is time to witness the answer to that great $1 million question Mordecai raises. Who knows what's going to happen next? It's not going to be an easy answer. As we said earlier, the name of God has not yet appeared, and it will not appear in the remaining chapters 5 through 10 of Esther. The closest we get will still be that question, who knows? And yet, in the same way that seeming silence of God had this cumulative effect, like it made you wonder, is he with us still? In that same way, what happens next from chapter 5 through chapter 10, it will also have a cumulative effect. What happens next from chapter 5 to chapter 10 becomes for me this cumulative, resounding answer to the question, who knows? To the question, is God with us still? And when we look at the things that happen next, in my mind, it proves that the unspoken Redeemer of Esther is still with his people. He is still turning the tides and reversing the fortunes of those who put their trust in him. And though God's name is silent in this story, his presence is about to be powerfully felt. And that's what I want us to consider this morning. And to me, the best way to consider God's role in the book of Esther is actually to take a step back and look at the big picture. So I've given you that handout for those of you who have it available. That is just one way of taking a look at the big picture. And what we find when we look at the big picture is that this is one big connected story of how God not only acts on behalf of his people, but he doesn't just make things better. He actually turns every misfortune that was going against his people on its head. He reverses their tragedies and turns them into joy. And as each one begins to fall and each one begins to change, we can't help but see that God is among them. So let's take a look at that story today. So in the first 4 chapters of Esther, chapters 1 through 4, you know, if you've been following along in this series, there's a series of bad things that just keep happening to the Jewish people, right? They are listed in the left-hand column of your page if you're following along. And a lot of those bad things that happen have to do with one man, the big, bad, wicked man named Haman, right? It was Haman who got so angry when Mordecai refused to bow to him, and therefore Haman decided to bribe the king of Persia for the destruction of the entirety of the Jewish people. And when Haman went to the king hands him his signet ring and says, "Do what you will." And Haman takes and puts into law and seals it the destruction of the Jews. There is a reason why by chapter 4, verse 3, the entire Jewish population of Persia is weeping and mourning and wailing, because this series of bad misfortunes has begun to unfold. Calamity is on the horizon, and where's God? Silence. Where is he to step in and change these things? Not a word does the story say. And it's not just the things that Haman has done that are stacking up against God's people. What also does it mean that the king of Persia is a king like he is, who every time he makes a decision, it seems to be ruthless and thoughtless and vain? He's the kind of guy who would make Haman his right-hand man. Like, who does that? He's the kind of guy who would just expel his queen Vashti, banish her on a whim. The kind of guy who would write a law that made the destruction of an entire group of people a reality without even giving it a second thought. And this is the one who's in power, and you're thinking, this is not good when it comes to God's people getting through this. And Esther has been made queen, but we talked at length last week about how she can't just run into the king's presence without worrying that she's breaking the law and she could be put to death. And not only that, but she really feels like she's fallen out of favor with the king. It's been a month, according to chapter 4, verse 11, a whole month. And she hasn't seen the king at all. And here all of these things are stacking up against them. Where is God? When is he going to step in? Silence. And it begins to look like who can save them from such troubles. But just at the moment when things start to get to that point of feeling helpless, that's when the tides begin to turn. And it's not just that things get better. It's that things are completely reversed. And when we see the way that things are completely reversed, that's when we can't help but wonder, is this God's doing? So what I'd like to do now is just pick up in chapter 5 and kind of walk our way through this story. And I want you to pay attention to the way that the tides are turning. Think about that series of bad things that had been happening. See what happens next. So in Esther chapter 5, verse 1, Esther works up the courage. Esther works up the courage, and now she is ready to go into the king's presence. And even though she feels that she's fallen out of favor, and even though she knows it could cost her her life, she steps before the king. And in chapter 5, verse 2, take a look at this. When the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And notice, this is before she even makes a request. Verse 3, the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even up to half my kingdom." So 1 minute ago, Esther was worried that she might lose her life for going before the king. 1 minute ago, she was worried that she had totally fallen out of favor. And now when she does approach the king is so enamored with her that he's offering her half his kingdom. What changed? Look in your Bible and find the reason it gives. It's silent on what changed. But you know what else Esther is silent about, don't you? So the king says, what's your request? Esther replies, I want you to come to a banquet with me. And let's just make it you and me and Haman. So the king agrees. And of course, you know Haman, he loves praise and honor. He's really ready to go to that banquet. So they go to the banquet together. They have a great time. Then in verse 5, for the second time, the king says to Esther again, what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it's yours. What does Esther say? Why don't you come to a banquet with me again tomorrow? Let's just make it you and me and Haman again. We'll have a good time, and then I will tell you my request. So the king agrees. And you know that Haman agrees. Not once but twice. He's been invited to be the one guy at the big banquet with the king and queen. When he goes home from the palace that day, he is on cloud 9. Don't you believe it? Until verse 9, chapter 5. He goes through the king's gate. Who does he see? You know who he sees. He sees Mordecai. Mordecai, who wouldn't bow down to him and started this whole messy plot. And here's Mordecai again, and the text says that he neither rose nor trembled before him. And suddenly Haman, who was just on cloud 9, all he can do is brood again with anger. He goes home angry. He goes to his wife, verse 12, and he says, Queen Esther, let this banquet occur with just me and the king. She's invited me again tomorrow. Yet all this does me no good, so long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. What a lovely fellow Haman is, right? And then his wife, lovely lady that she is, says, Haman, you've got it all wrong. You're really blowing this out of proportion. Just hang him. Just build a gallows and hang him. And Haman says, what a lucky man I am that I have this marriage that's built on mutual cruelty to the innocent. And he begins to build this gallows to hang Mordecai on. Meanwhile, chapter 6, verse 1, the king could not sleep. And he doesn't have Netflix and he doesn't have NyQuil. So he does the very next best thing he knows to do, and he says, bring me the annals of the king, and why don't you read to me all of the great things that have happened while I have been king of Persia. So someone comes in and they start to read to him all of the things that have taken place while he was king of Persia, and they get to the part where Mordecai saved King Xerxes' life. You remember that? The end of chapter 2, Mordecai saves Xerxes' life. Well, they get to that part in the story, and Xerxes is remembering what Mordecai has done for him, and he's thinking, well, that was a pretty great thing. I'd like to do something great for Mordecai, too. So he says, get me Haman. Haman comes in. Verse 6, this is one of the best parts here. Chapter 6, verse 6, Haman came in. The king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? What is Haman thinking now? Well, he says that Haman said to himself, verse 6, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And so Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought. Bring one of the horses that the king rides. Bring the crown that is set on his head. And let the robes and the horse be given to a royal official. And let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor and lead them on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Well, you see where this is going, right? The king says, great idea. Why don't you do that for Mordecai? And the next thing you know, here's Haman, who was just so angry that Mordecai wouldn't bow to him. And here now is Haman, and he is going to have to lead Mordecai through the city on a horse, the king's horse, proclaiming to anyone who can hear the praises of Mordecai. And just like that, their roles are just totally reversed. What are the odds that on the same night that Haman is building a gallows, on that same night the king couldn't sleep and happened to read about Mordecai? Those odds aren't great. Esther's silent about how it all happened that way. But you know what else it's silent about too. And then comes the great banquet scene, chapter 7. And for the third time, chapter 7, verse 2, the king says, "What is your request? Ask me anything, Esther." And now it's the moment of truth. Esther reveals the trouble of her heart. Verse 3, she says, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted to me as my wish. Let my people be spared for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated." And when the king hears this, he's just outraged, but also a little bit dull because he can't figure out how this thing could have taken place. And he says, "Who did this?" And Esther turns and she says, "Our foe and enemy, it was Haman." And by the end of chapter 7, Haman is hanging on the very gallows that he had built for Mordecai. Totally turned on its head. But that's not all. In chapter 8, Esther goes before the king again. She says, we still need your help for my people. And what does the king do? But he takes his signet ring. Remember how he gave that to Haman? This time, he gives his signet ring to Mordecai, and instead of taking it and sealing destruction into the laws for his people, now Mordecai is taking that signet ring and sealing salvation into the laws of the Persians for his people. And suddenly letters are being sent out just like they were before. This time letters are being sent out not of a day of destruction, they're being sent out of a day of hope. And then in verse 15 of chapter 8, we find that the whole city of Susa shouted for joy. For the Jews there was light and gladness, joy and honor. You remember how in chapter 4, it was fasting and weeping, mourning and wailing. Now it is shouts of joy. What seemed impossible just a little while ago, suddenly everything's changed. And then in chapter 9, when the day finally comes, it is not a day of destruction. It is a day of victory. It is a day when God's people face a foe that should be stronger than they are, but they destroy them. They stand tall. They are victorious. Something totally unimaginable just days before. And it's happening before their eyes. In the face of destruction, the tides have turned. And in all of this, God's name has still not been spoken. And the closest we get still is Mordecai's "who knows?" But don't we hear that question a little differently now? Seeing all that has taken place, seeing the way that every tragedy has been turned on its head, we do know, don't we? The actions of God have spoken louder than words, and the unspoken Redeemer of God's people has made his presence unmistakably felt. There's one person who famously said, "The silence of God is deafening" in the book of Esther. His actions speak louder than words. And in this great demonstration of God's faithfulness to his people, I think we catch a little glimmer of the gospel, don't we? A little bit of the gospel story, which is a story of a dramatic reversal of fortunes. The story turned on its head. You and me, all humanity, We were in that place of helplessness and hopelessness. There was even a moment when Christ on the cross cries out, "Forsaken. Is God with me still?" And you know what followed that cry? Silence. But then, in the silence, the unspoken Redeemer goes about his work to redeem and to help, to deliver and to save. In Esther, we learn that no matter how it may seem or feel in the moment, the tides do turn. And with God on our side, there may be times when we do not know how this or that will turn out. We may also say, like Mordecai says, who knows? There may be times when we wonder, is God with us still? And feel the weight of that on our shoulders like the people here in Persia. And yet, we do not have to wonder, will the tides turn? We do not have to wonder, will God be faithful to his promises? We do not have to wonder, will God be victorious in the end? Because God's actions speak louder than anything we may be feeling in the moment. And he is good. And he keeps his promises. The weight of his actions tell us that God will be with us. And in the words of our scripture reading from a moment ago, Luke chapter 1, verse 78, we can trust that by the tender mercies of our God, the dawn from on high will break upon us to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet in the way of peace. That's Esther's story. That's the gospel story. And maybe it's a story that you need to respond to in your life today. Maybe we need to be encouraged to put our faith in God in those times when it might seem or feel like we're on our own. In those times when it might seem and feel like everything is stacked up against us. We still face uncertainties in this life, and yet one thing is certain. The tides do turn. And God will prevail, keep his promises to those who put their trust in him. Maybe what you need to respond to today is the light of the gospel itself, which also is a story of tides turning. When Jesus died on the cross, he made it possible to be forgiven. When we are buried in baptism, raised up again, we are washed clean of our sins. Improbable as it is, we are children of God, right with God, belonging with him forever. Maybe you need to take hold of that today. However you may be called or challenged this morning, let's respond to our Redeemer while we stand and while we sing.
Into Jesus for the claim.